My name is Teresa Larson, and I'm speaking with Art Ketelsen in his home here in Ames, Iowa. And the date is August 17th, 2012. And Art, do I have your permission to record your voice and your picture today?
You want my voice, but what do you want me to say?
Well, I've got the first question for you, if
All
that
right.
answers yes. Please tell me the date you were born and where.
Okay, I was born in Chicago, Illinois on February the 12th, 1920, in the Logan Square area, which was a tenement area. And there was a second floor apartment with a midwife.
So you were not born in a hospital.
Never born in a hospital, never saw a doctor until I was 8 or 9 years old.
What did your dad do?
My dad was with the Railway Express Company, was on the road. What he did in those express cars, I do not know, but he had a great job. We never felt much of the depression because he worked all the time.
So did you go to school in that Logan Square area?
I went to grammar school in the Logan Square area. I went to grade school in another area. I went to high school in another area. So I got to know part of Chicago pretty well.
And for people who might not be familiar with Chicago, can you give a general location from some landmark of where you...
Logan Square would have been probably 20 blocks west of the Loop, about even with the Loop, north or south.
Okay. And when you went to high school, was it a public high school with girls and boys, or was it a little bit different?
Well, it was a little bit different according to today's road. It was, the name of the high school was Lane Tech. It was at Addison and Western Avenue. It was an all-boys school. It was a technical school. They trained students to become workers in factories or in offices, or they had one session of the curriculum which was for engineers. I happen to have two very good friends that were born a little later than I was that did graduate from Iowa State and also graduated from Lane Tech. But,
So it gave you a good preparation. I mean, you had the basics, really good there.
Any way you want, you could.
How big was your graduating class?
My graduating class was 600. The class right behind me was over 1,000. The number of students in that school is over 4,000.
That's a big school for those times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you graduated from high school in February of 1938.
38.
And it was the Depression.
Yep,
Yeah.
I was out of work until September, October of 38 when I finally bought a job and became an office boy to a wholesale hardware firm, Hibbard, Spencer, and Bartlett, which was on the Chicago River right next to the Tribune building.
How'd you get that job? How did you...
1 week's pay.
1 week's pay?
1 week's pay.
So you had like an agent?
Yeah,
or...
that's the way they did it in those days.
Uh-huh. But 1 week's pay, that was probably a pretty significant
Probably
sum.
$16 or something like that.
So what did you start to do for Hibbard, Spencer, and Bartlett?
Well, like I say, I was an office boy for a year,
Mm-hmm.
and then I got into I went down to the warehouse and worked for a year because I wanted more money. And one day it dawned on me I should be getting a little more money. I was getting $8 a week to start with. I went to 12 when I went into the warehouse, and 12 wasn't quite enough to get along. At least I didn't think. And I went to the office manager and I says, I'd like a little more money. He says, well, I'll tell you what we can do. We can send you to the unloading dock Monday morning, and you'll work with a bunch of fellows unloading freight cars or the barge or whatever. I said, well, that's fine. So the first Monday, it was a freight car that we were unloading, and it was ammunition. The boxes were about 60 or 70 pounds of shotgun shells, and that was a rough day, but I did live through it. And the next morning was a load of 55-gallon oil drums, and that was the crying straw. That was the end of the road. I said, you can't get by. I went back to the office manager, got my old office boy job back. But then later on, I got, year or so later, I got put in the Iowa sales department division, and I handled Iowa customers and so forth, although I'd never been in Iowa.
So you were handling Iowa customers for Hibbard, Spencer, and Bartlett.
Yeah.
And so what you were doing was when they had orders for their hardware stores, you would help them get what they needed.
Yeah, sometimes I came into Chicago. Actually, that's the first time I met Mr. Rogers from Carr Hardware and Joe Seelig from Iowa City. And I took care of a lot of their business until the war started.
So you were in the war for about 2.5 years?
2.5 years.
Yeah. So, and you were with the Air Force?
With the Air Force.
Uh-huh.
Flying a B-17, which was most of my airtime.
And that must have been kind of a nail-biting experience.
Well, it was nail-biting. Fortunately, I didn't get to the nail-biting until the very short time at the end of the war. I flew in combat March and April of 45. But up until then, it was all flight training.
Well, you probably were discharged in 1945, about that time.
Fall of 45.
And what was your personal life situation? Were you married or you had a family yet?
I was married and had a family. And I got home and saw my wife. I had seen my son a few months earlier. And I said to Dolores, I said, I'm going to go down and see if I still got a job. This was on a Monday morning. I finally got downtown, got to the office and checked in, and I said to my boss, his name was Steinman, Mr. Steinman, I says, well, yeah, do I still have a job? He says, yeah, you got a job. You're going to be out in Iowa next week. I said, I'd never been in Iowa. I've been gone 3 years, and you're going to send me out to the boondocks. But that's the way it was. And that Sunday, let's see, Sunday morning, I think I got on the Northwestern or the UP and got out here in Ames and got off the train and walked down to the Sheldon Munn. Carr Hardware was right across the street, would be my first call on a Monday morning. And that's the way it all started.
So your job at that time, when you got out of the service, was to visit hardware stores, probably some region in Iowa.
I was really a traveling
Salesman,
yeah.
exactly. So you were representing Hibbard,
Hibbard,
Spencer,
Bartlett.
Bartlett, and selling products and traveling up and down the road, so to speak.
Well,
yeah,
between here and Iowa City.
Probably along maybe would have been Highway 6, something along there, or maybe Highway 30.
Well, 69 and Highway 6
Yes,
to Iowa City, that was the main road.
main road.
Couldn't find a home in Ames to live, but we did locate in Newton. And we found a house we rented, finally bought a house in Newton. We were there for 9 years.
And so you're traveling this whole time,
Yeah,
back and forth along that
back
road.
and forth.
Okay,
Yep.
9 years. Yeah.
9 years. On
Okay.
road.
So, what took you off the road?
Huh?
What took you off the road? How did you?
Well, Mr. Rogers with owner of Carr Hardware was having a little labor problem, and he convinced me to join him at the hardware store. I was traveling. I shouldn't have been doing that with young boys. I should be home in the evenings with them while they're young and have more time with the family. And we finally decided, okay, we'll come to Ames. And we did come to Ames. Moved into Ames and found a home on 1416 Curtis, home built by Reinhard Friedrich, that summer of '54 and moved in.
Mm-hmm.
What Frank Rogers didn't tell me was that the job was 24/7, which I soon found out it was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Up until then, I've been working 4 days a week, and my children wondered what was going on. Period.
Here you thought,
Yeah.
ownership, management, it was going to be okay.
You could be working the store and footloose and fancy free, but that's not the way it was.
Well, if we can go back for just a second, because Carr Hardware had existed for a long time. So if we
Yeah.
can go back in history.
Okay.
And I just have to ask. I mean, I told people I was going to be talking to you, and
Yeah.
they laughed and they said, well, sometimes we've called him Mr. Carr because it was Carr Hardware. And they said, well, does it have anything to do with carpool?
It didn't have anything to do with carpool. And if you want the story, it goes something like this. That when Frank Rogers and Hamilton started this hardware store in Ames, they didn't want to name it Hamilton Hardware, they didn't want to name it Rogers Hardware, they didn't want to name it Ames Hardware, but they had a young man working for them by the name of Carr, and he's a high school boy. And they called him in the office one day and they asked him if he'd like to, if they could use his name. They thought that was a catchy name for a hardware store. And it was catchy. And the kid said, I don't care what you name it. So they named it Carr Hardware after this young boy. And he was with them until the fall of the year when he left. So we didn't have a good background there, but that's the way it was.
Do you have a rough time period when Carr Hard was named? Can you kind of come up with a rough time frame on that? I'm putting you on the spot here, but
I don't know about that, but years and years later, a lady stopped in the store one day and she said, I got a couple pictures that I want to show the manager. And I said, well, I'm one of the managers. So she went out in her car and brought these two pictures in, and they were pictures of not this store, but the store that was across the street before they built the new building. And there was three fellas in this picture and then one at the store. And one was this high school kid, and she says, that was my son.
what a great picture.
And that's the way it started. These two pictures are down in Sigler's building downtown, if you ever want to look at them.
Good.
In the back on the wall someplace.
To see the original car.
The original car.
So you mentioned this Mr. Hamilton, who must have had some money in the store.
Yeah.
And he was from a different town?
Oskaloosa.
He was from Oskaloosa.
Yeah.
And so did Mr. Rogers buy out Mr. Hamilton along the line somehow? Or?
Along the way, as time went on.
Uh-huh. So you had also mentioned that Carr Hardware had kind of moved. Of course, when you came to Carr Hardware in 1954, it was across the street from the Sheldon Bun.
Yeah.
But the original Carr Hardware was a little bit east and on the north side of the street.
North side of the street.
Right.
Where that exercise outfit is, or whatever you want
Yeah.
to call
Right.
it, taekwondo or whatever.
And it later became the China Center, which Rogers actually ran.
Which was Mrs. Rogers and the son Richard Rogers.
Mm-hmm.
They left the hardware store and went over there with their china and stuff because he didn't care much for hardware. So the son-in-law and I took over the hardware store.
So let's talk a little bit about what Main Street was like when you came in 1954. And wasn't that when you started? I think 1954, something around
54 is when I moved to Ames.
Ames, yeah,
I
yeah.
came to Ames in 45,
Right.
after the war. Yeah.
So what was it like? What was it like on Main Street? Was it friendly? What were there parking meters? Kind of paint me a
It was
picture.
friendly. It was almost at the end of the horse and buggy days, you might say, where people parked on the Main Street on Saturday night. It was a slow-moving little town, far different than it is today.
What were your hours of your store when you?
We're 8 to 5:30. That was before things went to pot, working wise.
You were open on a Saturdays but not Sundays.
Not on Sundays, not until later.
Did you have a slogan in the 1950s for your store?
Well, the store had a sales slip. At the bottom of the sales slip was 10,000 items for your convenience. That was their slogan. I have one fellow out here in Northcrest that keeps kidding me. He was always looking for the 10,001 item. And I hear that daily when I bump into him.
So tell me a little bit about how you decided what to carry in your store. Nowadays there are computer programs, and like if something gets sold from a shelf, there's a computer notification to remind you to order something else and all this kind of stuff. But how did you know what to put on your shelves?
Well, we really didn't realize we had salesmen coming in, and we had people asking for different stuff, which we'd add. I don't know where it all started, but you can pile up a bunch of items in no time at all. I think just the trends, what people were advertising is what we carried mainly.
And were you able to carry all of your inventory in your store, or did you have kind of satellite places where you stored things?
We just had one warehouse across the tracks where we carried surplus stuff, but most of it we carried right in that building.
Did most of your inventory arrive by freight train?
Well, that's a good thing to mention. When I was on the road, Frank Rogers had everything shipped into that store that I sold him by the Northwestern Railroad. He was a very loyal man to the city of Ames or to the area. Patronized anybody that had anything to do with the area. So all my merchandise that I sold Carr Hardware came in by Northwestern Freight, which sometimes took 2 or 3 weeks out of Chicago, where my other customers all had it come in by truck almost overnight. That's the way things went.
But you probably eventually switched to...
We eventually went, once
You tried.
Northwestern changed over to UPY. And then as times got a little tougher, he finally switched over to truck too.
Right. Did you have any catalogs in the store so you'd know what to carry and that sort of thing? I mean, was there sort of like a standard inventory for a hardware store?
Well, I guess I had one old one that was 100 years old, but then we had some modern ones that they put out.
I believe that Heber, Spencer, and Bartlett was kind of the origin for True Value Hardware, isn't that right?
That is right. That
Okay.
was their slogan. Back in 1932 that started.
What was your best kind of advertising?
Probably the brochures that they put out that we mailed out to mailed or hand delivered or whatever to our customers.
But you had a lot of personal attention in the store. I mean, that was the era of a lot of service.
We had a lot of good old people working for us.
Tell me about some of your staff.
Well, we had one fella who was named H. Lewis. We called him the fountain of all knowledge because he came from over on the Mississippi River. His father evidently had a hardware store at one time. And when he went to college here, I forget what house he belonged to, but he was a good customer of Carr Hardware. And eventually, after he graduated, he wound up working for Carr Hardware. I don't know how that happened. Then we had another fellow by the name of Brown, was a retired school superintendent. Excellent command of the English language, and he knew a lot about it. And we had another fellow by the name of Russell.
I think you had a paint man.
Got a slip in my mind here.
It'll come back to you.
Well, anyways, he was a retired farmer that gave us a lot of help.
And you had a fellow who came to work for you regarding paint that got to your store in kind of a funny way.
Oh yeah, we had Robert Clark. People remember him as being head of the paint department in Montgomery Wards. And we tried to hire Bob Clark away from Wards, but never got the job done until one morning Wards was having some sort of sales meeting in the store on Main Street, and some supervisor was on Bob Clark's back about the way he was displaying paint. And Bob took it for about 2 hours, and finally he said, "Young man, are you through talking?" And the fellow says, "Yes, I'm through." He said, "Well, I'm leaving." And he took his hat, walked out of the door, across the street, into our store, all the way across back to the office, knocked at the door, and Frank Rogers was sitting at the desk. And Bob Clark said, "Frank, how'd you like to hire the best paint salesman in Story County?" And Frank Rogers says, "You're hired."
Well, I think you also had some good students that came out of the Ames High DECA program.
Yes. We had several good students. And one in particular was Jan Sveck. His father was a professor at ISU. And I went to his father's funeral in later years. And I had a nice visit with Jan that evening. And Jan related a little of his experience at Carr Hardware. And he said, "You know, if it hadn't been for you fellas, I never would have got through school." He says, "Dad paid for my tuition and so forth, but you paid for my rooming and boarding and so forth. I really thank you for that." He says, "But the experience I got at Carr Hardware was second to none. I learned a lot." He says, "One particular time in my educational life at ISU, I had one professor that just rode me something awful. I could not do a thing right for this guy, so help me." And he says, one Saturday I was working down in the basement, which we have a lot of service down there. And he says, this professor came in with a little plumbing problem. And I was free and I helped him out. I got his problem solved. I knew more about something than he knew. And that made my day, made my life. So that's the way it goes.
Gave him confidence.
Yep.
He knew.
He's a very successful young man here,
Yeah.
here in the area.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, since you talked about somebody coming down into the basement, you have to talk about customers. When you run a retail business, as long as you run a retail business, you just see all kinds of people.
All kinds. we had some that would scare our clerks away. They had problems with them before, and they take off for cover. But that's the way life goes.
You're hoping you're on a coffee break when Mr. XYZ comes in, huh?
we had one clerk, people know him, his name was Pinta, and he worked down in the basement. He was in the service department all the time. And Pinta was a great smoker. And down in that basement in the back corner, we had no smoking signs all over creation, but we couldn't stop Pinta from smoking. We'd walk down there and I'd say, "Everett, you smoking?" He'd, "No." I'd say the smoke would be coming out of his collar. Well, anyways, he passed away after I got out of there. I'm not going to go any further.
Okay, all right, that's fine. That's fine. So I know that you had those ladders that would those sliding ladders that go back and forth.
On each side of the store, they were great. You know, those ceilings are about 20 feet tall, and we had to get merchandise in those shelves up there. But the terrible part of those ladders were sometimes things would be quiet in the store, and all of a sudden you'd hear one heck of a scream, screech, or whatever you want to call it. And of course, we knew what was going on, but customers didn't know what was going on. But what had happened, some young kid had crawled all the way up to the top of those steps and didn't know how to get down. Oh man, we never lost the one, but they scared the daylights out of us. Have to crawl up and bring them down.
Can't you just see, or I can personally see, a 3 or 4-year-old kid thinking that was the best ladder in the world, and they'd get way up 20 feet and there would be nowhere to go.
Well, that was something else.
Yeah. I bet you had some really loyal customers, people that just stayed with you.
We had some great customers. We had some great customers, and we had some peculiar customers. We did a lot of service for people without charging, just by helping them out, I guess you might say. But we had one fella, every spring, he'd bring in his tank sprayer, and he'd have one of the boys check it out to see that it was going to work. Mm-hmm. And they'd put in parts and so forth, wouldn't charge this guy a cent. And one day, one of these intellectual fellows that had work, and he said, "We're not going to do that anymore." I said, "All right, we'll charge them for the parts and not for the labor." Well, this spring come along, and in comes this man, I'm not going to mention his name, set the sprayer on the counter, and he said to Mr. Brown, "Take care of it, would you please?" And Mr. Brown took care of it. And a couple of days later, he came to pick up his sprayer, and I think there was about a 60-cent charge on it. And he paid the 60 cents, but that was the last we saw him.
Oh, well, so tell me about your job as manager of the store. What was your day like? You come in and...
Well, I was a manager, but I worked right along with the rest of them. I don't think it was anything different than opening up or closing, mm-hmm. and staying there all the time.
Mm-hmm. But you would get there surely at 8 o'clock.
8 o'clock and home at 6, whatever, the store closed.
Right.
It was just a routine job. I was one of the rest of them.
Mm-hmm. But you had to make decisions like who to hire.
Oh yeah, hired.
That's an important decision.
And I wasn't trained to hire people. I just hired them by looks more than anything. Had good luck through the years. Mm-hmm. My partner did some hiring too. Mm-hmm. Never mentioned my partner. My partner was Jim Daffin, the mm-hmm. son-in-law of Frank Rogers.
Yes.
Who was with me until 1979 when he decided to sell out.
Right.
After we had after we had bought the store on 24th Street, but not quite mm-hmm. opened it.
I'm going to follow up that thread of 24th Street in just a second, but before we leave kind of the running of the store, you were really successful. So how do you think you developed your management style, or where did you think, I mean, what kind of thought processes did you have that went into making the retail business on Main Street really work?
I think it just came naturally to us.
Mm-hmm. So you could bounce ideas off your partner.
Yeah. Or he could bounce ideas off of me, one or the other. I don't know if you ever knew him or not. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we'll put it this way. What kind of advice would you give to somebody if they'd wanted to run a store like yours?
I told them, be prepared to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Mm-hmm. And be conscientious about it.
Now, when you go
a
ahead,
lot of
please.
people have bought stores and sat back in the office, thought they'd run by themselves. And that doesn't go.
So you managed by walking around
mm-hmm.
and helping people.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or they helped me, one or the other.
So remind me where you lived in Ames at this time, and were you close to Carr Hardware at that time when you first started?
I was north of 13th Street on
okay.
Curtis.
When you moved to town in 54, okay.
Yeah, that was about halfway.
Right.
Under today's conditions.
And you drove back and forth to work then?
Back and forth, yeah.
I think at one time you told me sometimes you took employees back and forth too.
Well, I had a company truck, and anybody that lived between my house and the store, I'd pick up.
Mm-hmm.
That was 3 or 4.
Mr. Frank Rogers, of course, that's the person from whom you bought the business. Did he have advice for you, or did he have thoughts for you?
Well, the only advice he gave us was don't expect to make money every month or every year. He says you're going to have a bad one every once in a while, maybe 1 out of 10, and that's about the way it went.
Yeah, that's a pretty good average,
That
though.
isn't bad. No,
That's not bad.
No.
Now to some of the things that happened on Main Street, because you were on Main Street a long time.
Yeah.
Were there big events that you remember?
Well, probably the biggest event was when they had the explosion at City Hall on, what is that? That's Kellogg.
Mm-hmm.
That was in the afternoon or near the noon hour when that bomb went off. And our bay window just bulged out. I happened to be in the front of the store when that happened. And it went out and back in. Thank goodness it didn't pop.
Mm-hmm. Were you frightened?
Didn't know what happened. Didn't know what happened.
But could you see windows down the street that had
Some
immediately
windows
shattered?
had let go, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Everything, ours was built pretty well.
Mm-hmm. What happened next? I mean, did you keep the store open, or?
Well, we kept the store open. It just one of those things that happened during the noon hour, whenever it happened.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people didn't even know what happened, other than the boom.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, some of the damage that you could see as a
And
result.
I can't remember too much about it, other than I was working that day when it happened.
Mm-hmm. On a smaller crisis level, I remember you had told me once sometimes you didn't get out of the store on time for various reasons, and there was one lady who lost her keys.
Yeah, that's a horrible thing to think about. This one lady had a child, and to keep the child satisfied, she handed the kid her car keys. And it got to be 5:30, we're getting ready to close the store. Most of them had left. We had 2 or 3 fellas still there. And the lady says, "Oh, I can't find my keys. My son had them." And she asked the son, he didn't know where he put them. So then there was a frantic search for the keys. We tried to figure out where the kid had been to start with. And we went to all these different places. I think we finally did find the keys in a nail bin.
Oh my goodness.
We were lucky to find them then.
Yeah.
But those things will happen.
Yeah. I don't know what you want to say about this, but I've talked to other people who had businesses on Main Street in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And I just have to mention it. There was a person, a woman, who, in a polite terms, you might call her a lady of the night. Can you corroborate that there was such a person?
Yeah, there was such a person. She operated. I'm not going much further than that, or it would put me in jail maybe.
Are you telling me you could see customers come and go?
You know, you asked me what her name was. It was Sylvia. But I think Sylvia's rehabilitated her. She's gone from this good earth.
Mm-hmm.
But she was quite an interesting person.
Did you ever see her in the store? Did you ever walk through?
She'd been in the store.
She was in Carr Hardware?
She'd been in the store, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I won't ask what she bought. So I had promised I wanted to pick up the thread of expanding Carr Hardware to 24th and Grand.
Okay.
And I recall that at 24th and Grand, the store that the hardware store is now in was actually a grocery store.
It was Ames Fruit and Grocery Store.
Mm-hmm.
Owned by Abe Mazinski.
Mm-hmm.
And Abe had several stores in Iowa, several in Ames, and was a real good operator. People that remember Abe, he'd try to sell right to the bottom. He tried to sell those bananas until they were no longer ripe. But anyways, somewhere along the line, my partner and I thought we ought to have a store up there, and we thought that would be a good location for a hardware store. And for years, we tried to get Abe to unload. Well, in 1978, I had a chance, my wife and I, to go to Hawaii. And at that time, Abe was sort of leaning toward maybe. And I told my partner, I said, well, maybe I shouldn't go to Hawaii. I better stay here to see what happens. And Jim says, no, he says, you go to Hawaii. If something happens and he decides he wants to sell, I'll send you a cablegram. And he says, that cablegram will be, if he decides, it'll be just 2 words, buy pineapples. So we went on with a couple of the couples from Newton and had 3 weeks in Hawaii, and the last week the cablegram did come through. We were getting ready to come home anyways, buy pineapples, and that was the trigger. We came home and we signed the papers and bought Abe out.
So you had to cut your vacation short a little bit.
Open up.
But you bought pineapples.
But we ran the hardware store for a couple of years and couldn't make it.
Oh, you ran it as a grocery store.
As a grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
And then we finally shut it down, closed it out. Tried to sell the building, never got the building sold. And my wife said, well, let's put up the other hardware store. And that's the way it all started. By June of 1980, June 1st, we opened the hardware store.
Were you able to use any of the things that were there when it was a grocery store? Were you able to transition that way?
We used most of his fixtures.
Uh-huh.
We took out the ones closest to the door and put brand new ones out there in front, so it looked like a newly remodeled store, but the old ones are all behind that. And we got along pretty well.
A lot of merchants on Main Street belonged, some of them to coffee clubs and some of them to service organizations. Did you belong to a coffee club or?
I belonged just to the Lions Club.
To the Lions Club. And so did you join kind of right when you got here? Or?
Yeah, I joined probably 55.
Wow.
And they met across the street at the Sheldon Munn Hotel. At that time, we had about 110 members. It was a social club for a lot of Main Street people belonged to it.
So they met once a week, for example, maybe
once a week for lunch.
For lunch, okay.
In the ballroom or whatever was back there. It would seat about 100 people. It was a real nice location.
Are there some other merchants on Main Street, either living or not living at this time, that we might recognize that were in your Lions Club?
There was Max Burke. He was in the clothing business. And then there was it's kind of hard to think of names at this age. Gary Malone was New York Life man. He was very active. I can't think.
It's all right.
Manager Wards was pretty active. I can't think of his name.
Yeah. But it was probably a good thing in terms of the presence of your retail store to be involved in that kind of network.
Absolutely. Had a lot of fun.
Yeah. And you kind of keep up with what was happening on Main Street, who was hiring, who wasn't, and
whether we should open or close on Saturday night and so forth. We had a lot of discussions.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about hours, because when you said the job was 24/7, what you meant was when you would go home, you still had to solve through any of the problems of the day.
Yeah, and once in a while you get a call to go back at nighttime. Several times.
And what did those calls entail?
Had one night, it was close to New Year's Eve, phone rang and the police department called. Somebody had fallen through one of our bay windows in the front. And I went down, and sure enough, a couple of college boys were horsing around. one pushed the other into the window and knocked it out. There you got whatever size that big plate glass window was. I had to call Orning Glass, talk to Junior. I said, Junior, we got a problem there. We need that glass replaced. He said, oh my God, Art. He said, I've been in the sauce for about 6 hours. I have no condition to do that. But he did come down, got a sheet of glass, put it back in. So
Yeah.
sweep up the old glass from the sidewalk and clean it up before the next day.
Yeah.
Oh, anything could happen.
Yeah.
You're talking about working at nighttime there all night. Sometimes we went down and worked at nighttime, straightening out, doing something. And we had a lot of glassware on the sidewall sections, and those trains going by the back end of the store at nighttime, they weren't slowing down, they just rattled. And every once in a while those glasses would chipper, fall down to the floor, and who's breaking in this place? It was pure tough job.
Since you mentioned that, I want to talk about the inventory for just a second and how, or merchandise, or what you had for sale, changed. You probably started with more, I'm just going to call it hard goods, the raw elements of building, plumbing, whatnot.
Yeah.
But you did have housewares.
Yeah.
And
I was
then
very strong in housewares.
You were very strong in housewares. And those are those glasses that would migrate on the shelves.
Yeah, they fell pretty fast.
And so gradually, I'm sure, inventory changes, and you'd have new appliances and new kinds of newfangled things that would come in. Are there any stories that you remembered of having to make decisions about moving towards some new product or another?
Well, the big change was when they brought in Weber gas grills. That first Weber gas grill that came into the city of Ames came in on a Friday, I guess, and it was on display Saturday afternoon. And I walked in the store and I looked at the price on that grill and I said, Randy, that thing's never going to sell at $200-300. He said, well, it'll do something. And I said, okay. And that's when it all started. But he took that gas grill home that Saturday night, unbeknownst to me. That was his move. And they had a barbecue grill out in his backyard on Country Club Boulevard. Had a nice party. Everybody really enjoyed it. I'm quite sure some of them later on went down to buy a gas grill later on, as everybody has. And they went to bed that night after the party, but the next morning they woke up and the grill was gone. First, it was stolen.
So the first grill to arrive at Ames
First Weber
was the first stolen grill.
Was the first stolen grill. But anyways, it's been a great tool to outdoor barbecue.
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking about the good things about a hardware store. I mean, somebody always needs something.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That helps keep you in business.
That's right. And people that work in hardware stores, they enjoy business. This O'Donnell's up here is just super place for service.
Yeah, you have to have the goods with the ideas of how to use it and how to solve problems. Well, you're problem solvers, aren't you?
Yeah, I think that's right.
You.
Well, actually, I shouldn't say this in this university town, but I am a PhD. I got through 4 years of high school, but that PhD is professional hardware dealer.
That's good. Well, I always give people the opportunity at the end of a conversation to, if there's stories you want to tell me, if there's anything you want to remark about your time in Ames that you'd like to share that you like to tell people about.
Yeah. Well, this first house, I'm going to say this and that's about it. This first house we bought up on Curtis, it was the end of Curtis, beyond it north was Murray Drive. There was nothing north of us. The paving stopped right there. And we bought this house. It was brand new, a 2-bedroom house, and it was all sodded, and it was a beautiful home. But we never had much hot water. Couldn't figure that out. And we went to inspecting, and we were watering that sod with hot water. The plumber had screwed up. and he couldn't come in that store without blushing for 6 months.
That's a good story.
That's
a good story.
Messed up. That was the biggest one.
That's funny.
That's the biggest one.
That's good.
But
Okay.
I wouldn't change a thing about my life. I think I'm very fortunate to have lived through the Depression and got out, got a good job, not a high-paying job, but a secure job, and got sent out to Iowa instead of the tenement district of Chicago. Actually, my folks never had any cars or anything. They rented property all their lives. No, I've been very happy.
Thank you for sharing your stories, Art. I
Okay.
very much appreciate it.
Appreciate it.